in color. It was not an uncommon car, but I'm pretty sure that Paul's Chevy, his 64 Chevy, was the only one that was named Rimsky-Korsakov. Anyway, those are a few recollections from our early years. And thanks for all being here. And I will pass the baton.
Who's next?
It's going I'm next if you highlight me.
Yes, I'm trying to do this. There we go. There we go.
I'm back, everybody. Speaking on behalf of Bonnie Cassander, who is a lifelong friend of Paul's, who's asked me to read her comments. So this is from Bonnie Cassander. Paul and I went to high school together at Central High School in Valley Stream on Long Island, New York. Paul and I hung around with the same group and had a few classes together. But what brought us together was our concern about the war in Vietnam. We became very close friends, and the more I got to know him, the more I came to realize what a wonderful, interesting, and kind person Paul was. There was an English teacher at our high school, Tom Hackett, a wonderful man who suggested we do something instead of just complaining. So Paul and I spent 1968 to 1970, our junior and senior years in high school, organizing anti-war demonstrations in the park behind our school. We worked hard and did everything necessary to get the demonstrations up and running. We had some help from others, but for the most part, responsibility for planning and organizing the details, obtaining permits, selecting speakers, writing speeches, and publicizing the events fell on us. In the late 60s in Valley Stream, there was tremendous tension between those who supported the war and those who opposed it. Many of our protests turned confrontational. It often got loud and antagonistic. There was yelling, pushing, and even fighting. There were police at the demonstrations, and sometimes arrests and physical confrontations between police and student protesters. I remember vividly a time a student yelling that we were un-American and threw a lit match in Paul's hair, which at the time was a bushy fro. Luckily, we were able to extinguish the fire before his head was engulfed in flames. Getting to know Paul, working with him, and becoming his close friend was a delight. Paul was a wonderful friend. I could always count on him. Paul opened my eyes to new worlds, including, of course, the magic of the flute, and in particular, Jean-Pierre Rampal. At his prompting, we would occasionally get dressed up and go into Manhattan for musical performances, which was a big treat for us both. Paul was an amazing partner in political activism. He had vision and the ability to turn that vision into reality. He always kept our goals in the forefront, included others, and got the job done. Perhaps most profoundly, everybody working with Paul, or even just hanging out with him, always felt included, valued, and appreciated. The world is a better place because of Paul Taub and his political activism. I miss him. I am a better person for having known Paul. Paul taught me patience, how to listen, how to speak my mind, and how to respect and not denigrate those with differing views and opinions. Paul showed me how to be a kinder person. Thank you.
I'm Bob Steiner. I'm next on the list. I'm going to present what I have to say, highlighting two readings, both writings by Paul. I'm going to try to keep my personal comments short. I'm going to have to try to temper my typical long-windedness. Something that has not been mentioned thus far, and I'm kind of glad to be the one to introduce it, is the place where I met Paul, which was at the time we met in 1968 as 16-year-olds, called Bucks Rock Work Camp. And this is a setting that went on to play an enormous role in both of our lives and was the place in which our deep friendship was cemented. I'll have Paul, through his readings, speak more about that. But I want to say for myself that I was in touch with Paul very continuously in the latter months and weeks of his life. I knew how, well, I didn't quite know how dire his medical circumstances were, probably because of his own eternal optimism, which influenced me to be hopeful that what he was grappling with in terms of his health was not as dire as it turned out to be. I have spoken with Susan in the aftermath of Paul's death, and I think probably she knew better than he or I or maybe anybody how dire his circumstances were. Obviously, Paul led a bifurcated life on two coasts. Fortunately for me, he made trips virtually every year, sometimes more than once, to New York. So we were able to see each other on a continuous basis. I made a couple trips to the West Coast in which I saw him. I like to highlight a couple things. One is that Paul held both of my children as infants and had the opportunity to know them both as adults. I'm very happy to see that both of my children are on this Zoom event. Another thing I like to highlight is we both played a role, an important role in each of our weddings. Paul played a flute performance at mine. I had asked him to do that, and he did. And he asked me to say a few words at his and Susan's wedding. So I thought of about 5 words, and I said each one, and then each one represented a characteristic I exemplified who Paul was, and I spoke a little bit about each one. Paul had many mentors, the majority of them musicians, music teachers, master teachers. He spoke to me about them often. I remember the names of a few. But there was another mentor who was not a musical mentor, and this was a mentor whom we shared. A man by the name of Ernst Bulova. I don't want to slight his wife, Ilse Bulova, who is co-creator with him of Bucks Rock, where Paul and I met and in many respects grew up. Ernst Bulova was my mentor, as he, like myself, was a psychologist, a psychoanalytically trained psychotherapist, and a progressive educator. And though Paul has a different profession, one that Ernst was not part of, Paul depicts Ernst as a mentor in the truest sense. And this is the point where I want to switch over to the readings. First one, Susan shared with me, asked me if I thought be part of what I had to say, and I was very happy to say that it is. This is something, I'm only going to read a portion of it, that Paul wrote when he was 15 years old. That was the year before I met him. And it's called Bucks Rock Work Camp, 1967, my first year. I finally decided to write down my thoughts about camp. Today, on the day I'm home, no first draft or any crap of that sort. I just think that writing it down will help me remember it. This was the best summer I ever had. I loved every minute of it. It was just fantastic, unbelievable. I didn't think a place like this could exist. One where middle-class kids, mostly Jews, could get together and be happy. I wrote in my first letter home that happiness was so abundant it almost grew off trees. Well, it's not quite like that. Just like in any other group of 1967 teenagers, you have to get in with people. Bucks Rock would not be a place for a very withdrawn teenager. A person there must make a move to become friends. But you get a fair chance. I did a lot in the publication shop this summer. I was production manager of the yearbook. That is my main accomplishment of the year and something I'm very proud of. I'm also very proud of the fact that I was the art editor of the festival program. That makes me feel pretty sure of being a CIT, a counselor in training there next year. And this is me again speaking for myself. Paul certainly was a CIT the next year, and as was I in his cohort. We were then JCs and counselors for a decade. In 2001, that's where my second reading of a piece written by Paul comes in. I, along with my wife at the time, created a book in which we asked people who we knew, or well, I just knew in general, that Bucks Rock had had a profound effect on many lives. And I created a book of essays in honor of Ernst Bulova. I called it, But Then I Discovered Bucks Rock. And what I'm going to read now is a portion of the article I solicited from Paul that was a part of this journal of essays. My brother and I interviewed to be campers at Bucks Rock in the winter of 1967. And Ernst and Ilsa, as they told me sometime later, came to the incorrect conclusion that Fred would choose to attend camp, but that I would decide not to. Fred, in fact, never came to Bucks Rock, but I returned for enough summers that by my last, 1978, I was in the top 10, maybe even the top 5 in the popular game of measuring Bucks Rock longevity. Although I've lived on the West Coast now for 25 years, I've never forgotten the New Milford, Connecticut zip code or the route to camp, the old route along Route 22 through Golden's Bridge and all those traffic lights, which was still the way to get to camp my first couple of my dozen years. At camp, I evolved from the fastest slip sheeter in the publication shop to an assistant art director of the yearbook to music junior counselor and counselor for 9 subsequent years. I first learned how to produce events at camp, which is something I do professionally now as the director of a busy chamber music group. It was at Bucks Rock that I made my decision to pursue a life and career in music. The legacy that Bucks Rock and Ernst and Ilse have left me with is so ingrained in my attitude toward life that I find it hard to put into words. In part, it is the passion with which I commit myself to my music projects, and in part, it's my appreciation for people who have a passion for whatever it is that they devote themselves to. Ernst was unrivaled in his enthusiasm for my postgraduate reports on my career, and although I availed myself of his counsel and wisdom only infrequently over the years, he was someone I knew was always available to call upon when major issues arose. Although my contact with him was intermittent during the past 20 years, his presence was always deeply felt in dreams and in conscious thoughts of what would Ernst think about this or about that, which continues to this day. I had always felt so trusted and special at Bucks Rock, especially by Ernst. His faith in me has had much to do with my self-esteem and confidence. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those remarks. So now I'm going to start playing the first piece that has been provided by Lori DeLuca and her klezmer friends. It's highlighted in the program. The name of the piece is Zamir Atik. So
This is Zemer Atik, typical wedding dance.
Ruben. Corner. Okay, I think I'm up.
Okay, you know how to unmute yourself, right?
I'm already muted.
there you go.
Hello. My name is Roger Nelson. I've known Paul since 1979 when he first, and I also arrived at Cornish to teach at the Cornish College of the Arts. But I want to start, before I say anything else, I want to relate an experience that happened to me yesterday, going with my wife Heidi. We went up out of North Bend here outside of Seattle and picked chanterelle mushrooms, something that Paul really enjoyed and liked to have to share in the bounty that nature provided. He and I went there a number of times in the 80s, as far back as this, and this is a private place for me anyway, that I found, and I've not related to very many people where it is. That's what mushroom pickers do. Anyway, this was a lovely experience, and I know he would have enjoyed it because he loved to do things like that. When we arrived in Seattle to teach in 1979, we were young. He was still in his 20s. I was a little bit older. In many ways, we grew up together in that job, becoming at first raw, unseasoned professors, and then later more seasoned, more perhaps wiser, certainly better able to communicate with our students. But we continually pursued artistic activities at the same time, which was very important, partly because the pay wasn't very great, but that wasn't the main reason. It was mostly because we were interested in doing a lot of things. Paul particularly, and myself were members of a new performance group. That was the name of the group, which thrived for some 20 years, which we did hundreds of premieres and new works by many composers, as well as older works. And it was a fabulous experience. We traveled with that group. We went to various cities in the US, around the Northwest as well. And he was a devoted member to this group. And it was a lot of fun. We had great times together. And it was always in the pursuit of music making together, even if sometimes we didn't make much money. That wasn't the point. It was to experience the togetherness that we all shared. So a shout out to all those members that were in that group. Lori DeLuca is one of them. We just heard her play. She wasn't always there, but she was there for a significant amount of time. But during all this time, I'd say the big thing about Paul was his devotion to and mentoring of students. He was more than just a teacher. He was their friend and a colleague in many ways to his students. He'd play music with them as equals. He didn't treat them as underlings or otherwise inferior individuals. And I know you'll hear from Melinda probably about that. So I think that was important to know and feel about Paul, and all the experiences I've heard from other speakers today about his Bucks Rock experiences and other things of that sort gave him insights which he used in his teaching. And he was a very beloved teacher. But he and I shared a lot of experiences together, which I want to just say a few things of, because I think they're interesting for me. One of the pictures we saw was him in front of his bicycle and with his flute. We did a number of bike rides together. We also shared tales, and mostly true tales, about our gardening expertise. We also went on many tours together as a pianist, violinist, pianist, flutist. We shared interest in wine. He participated in a couple of different summer festivals with me, and he loved to travel and see the world. I know he went many places with Susan, and especially enjoyed places where he could speak French, because he spoke French well. But that would not exclusively, of course. He went all over the place. So he was a great colleague, I'd say. As a professor, we even shared a studio a couple of years at Cornish. Aside from the new performance group experience and his advocacy for new music, we also had a group with Matt Kosmarowski, a percussionist, called Taneko. It was used the first two letters of each of our names: Taub, Nelson, and Kosmarowski. One of the pieces we performed was a 4.5-hour work by Morton Feldman, kind of a minimalist style composer. And Paul had the hardest job because he had to blow his flute for 4.5 hours without a break. We, the others, both Matt and I, we could stand up, sit down, move around a little bit, but we weren't constantly blowing. But it was quite an event. Another event that I want to bring up is in 1990 for the Goodwill Arts Festival here in Seattle. Paul commissioned a work by Sergei Slonimsky, who was the nephew. He lived in, I think, Moscow, or I'm not sure where. Anyway, somewhere in Russia. But his uncle, Nicholas Slonimsky, also was going to be at the festival and was also commissioned to write a piece, which we performed. And Nicholas was at the time 96, and he had been living in LA, but he came up, flew up. And one of the things Paul got to do, which is very memorable, and somebody else mentioned his typewriter. Well, Paul got to play a typewriter, a manual typewriter, as part of Nicholas's piece, which I think was very charming. So Paul, you know, in general, I'm thinking Paul was such a generous soul. He was such a good friend who always had nice things to say about people. He was serious. I'm not saying he wasn't. He cared a lot about politics. He cared about equality. But he had a wonderful ability, which I think someone alluded to, which was to relate to pretty young children, particularly. They found him delightful, especially infants, as if he was one of them. He had a childlike personality that he could use and turn on when he wanted to. And I think that infected his way of being as an adult, and how he related to other people, adults and other people of all ages. You know, my feeling about Paul was that he was a great spirit that traveled through and influenced a lot of us. And I'm very happy that I got to know him and work with him and do a lot of things with him. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Melinda Abendroth. Many of you have spoken about Paul's mentors. I was one of his students, so he was my mentor. I was one of his students at Cornish, where Roger and he both taught me. I was a flute student of his. I graduated in 2014. And I just wanted to share a few memories I have of Paul, and just say that all of the wonderful things that you have said about Paul are the things that made him such a phenomenal teacher. You know, his gentle and kind spirit prevailed in his teaching, and it was what made him such a special teacher, and what really managed to bring the magic of music alive to so many of his students. Those of us in his flute studio knew whenever Paul was in the building, because he would always pick up his flute and play the same scale passage that had a little trill at the beginning, that we all learned to imitate. And his kindness and gentleness translated into patience. He was an incredibly patient teacher. I was not a very patient student and would come to him unbelievably frustrated with a passage that I couldn't get under my fingers. And he would infuriate me by saying, well, it's really not that difficult. And that was his gentle way of saying, well, you just kind of need to practice more. He had an enthusiasm for what he did, and it was so exuberant that he couldn't contain it within his body. When he got excited about music, he would bounce up on his toes. It did not happen very often in my lessons, but when it did, it was a huge victory for me. And he would often end up subconsciously bouncing up on his toes while he was performing. And I always knew then that his performance was going really well if I saw that happen. He, despite being gentle, was incredibly fierce and very protective of his students as well. I never felt like I was alone in what can be a fairly daunting administrative system of school. I always knew I had Paul on my side, and even after graduating, Paul went out of his way to continue to mentor, especially those of us in that class. He wrote both Daniel and I over a weekend. He wrote both of us 4-page letters of recommendation when we had found a scholarship at the last minute that would mean we could potentially go to a master's program overseas. And he went out of his way to always make sure that to check in on us and to see that we were doing okay. But his biggest gift, I think, which I didn't realize quite how unique was to him, and particularly in the flute world, and I know he influenced everyone surrounding him with it, was that he managed to introduce flute players to each other as collaborators, not competitors. And in a field where there are never enough orchestral seats for how many flute players there are, he said that's not the way that we should look at each other. And everything he did was to say that we should commission more works for multiple flute players because flute is a wonderful instrument and everyone should play it. So I just want to say thank you to everyone. And yeah, he was really a wonderful mentor and meant a lot to all of us. So thank you.
Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Oh, thank you. I didn't know. Kim,
I think so.
where's my duo? Where's Kim?
I don't know. I should be there, but I'm not.
Maybe you could highlight Kim also, if that's possible. Two of us on the screen because we're presenting
I
together.
didn't realize that was the case. I will try and find Kim and share and see if I can share the spotlight.
Okay.
Kim, shall we wait?
Nah, I think
Shall I start?
dead
then?
air is not a.
Or do you want to start? We've constructed it that you start, but I could start, whatever you want.
See, oh, there we are.
Great, thank you, Beth.
Hi. I'm Kim Mackay, and I worked with Paul, was friends with Paul, largely through the Cornish Federation of Teachers. But I want to start. Do you want to introduce yourself first before I go on?
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yes, thank you all, and Susan, and to your families for inviting us to this event. I'm so honored and touched what I've heard about Paul. Of course, you know, all of it is so resonant with us. So I'm Elizabeth Darrow. I'm calling from Montana right now, but often in Seattle. And I'm an art historian and professor. I was a professor at art history at Cornish from 2007 to 21, and a friend and colleague of Paul's in the Cornish Federation of Teachers for 15 years. And I recently retired in this spring from Cornish.
One of the things I was going to say about why we're doing this split screen thing, it has to do with Paul, that it's kind of how we worked in the Cornish Federation of Teachers. There's a lot of tag teaming, a lot of handing things off, and different people taking on different roles and working together pretty seamlessly in ways that are echoed in a lot of what people have said about Paul and the way he worked. But I first met Paul in 92, I think it was, in the spring of 92. I had the opportunity to teach in what Cornish used to have, an inter-arts class, where there's a faculty member from each department at Cornish, and Paul was the music guy in the room. And it happened to be the semester, or one of the times, that John Cage and Lou Harrison both did a week-long residency at Cornish, and they came to our class. They spent one of our 3-hour meetings with us. And it was an amazing time. And one of the things that still amazes me is that I didn't know that Paul had worked through the New Performance Group, worked with Cage, had known his music and him as well as he had, and with Lou Harrison too. He never really brought up that fact. He was just one of the faculty among the six, I think there were 7 or 8 of us, however many departments there are, working to make the most of that opportunity of having Cage and Harrison in the room to bring that kind of the history of music and American music in the 20th century to our students. But I did know after that he organized the
festival of Cage and Harris and then Henry Cowell's music in 2009 that built on their legacy from when they worked together in the 30s and through Cornish and spreading out from Cornish and drums along the Pacific. And what strikes me is about that is an example of Paul's constancy and commitment. He was always commissioning and performing new music, but it wasn't new music just because it was new, and it certainly wasn't to find fame and fortune, but it's because the new music is exploratory and expanded the range of the possible. And that's central to what Paul showed me as a presence in my Cornish teaching life and in my time as part of the Cornish Federation of Teachers, his commitment to the possible. Let me see, I actually wrote quite a bit, and Elizabeth and I have been communicating about this. I live in Sweden, and that's where I'm calling you coming from, and Elizabeth is in Montana. So I was thinking about our time working collectively on bargaining, the collective bargaining agreements. And though we often disagreed with those on the other side of the table, which I sometimes referred to as the dark side, Paul kept returning to the idea that those people on the other side, also had the good of the college and the good of the whole as a guiding principle, even if they were really wrong about how they thought about that. And I think of all the work that Paul did for the union and for many other organizations, the Flute Association, the Chamber Music Association, the Seattle Chamber Players, and so on, the necessary organizational administrative work. And it occurred to me that he devoted that extra time and energy as a very pragmatic commitment to the possible, that you can't just think of things as possible and hope that they'll come true, but taking the steps necessary to make the possibilities realities. Even though he knew the outcome would not always be what he or any of us might have wished, he did what was necessary to keep things moving so the hoped for outcomes would be possible. And as I was reading this and thinking of Paul, something from Rebecca Solnit's Hope in the Dark came to mind. She writes, "Hope is an embrace of the unknown and the unknowable, an alternative to the certainty of both optimists and pessimists. It's the belief that what we do matters, even though how and when it may matter, who and what it may impact, are not things you can know beforehand. You may not, in fact, know them afterwards either, but they matter all the same. And history is full of people whose influence was most powerful after they were gone." Paul was at his core hopeful, filled with and exuding hope, committed to the possible. I was thinking, he wrote to both Elizabeth and I, maybe others, I don't know, the night before he died, and describing some of what he could about his diagnosis then. And it ended with hopefulness. He had an appointment with specialists for a treatment plan the following Monday, I think. And I don't know if you have it there in front of you, Elizabeth. I don't. The last few sentences were, at least I know what's happening, and I'm hopeful about the next chapter, something like that.
Right. Yes. I mean, he recognized how serious it was. He wasn't a Pollyanna in that email to us, but he was doing the work. He was going to do it. He was plugging away, and it was very profound for us, that he passed away that night or that morning. I'm not entirely sure, but that is quality of his that I learned also with Kim in the union work, which is hard at times to be positive, very hard. So do you want to talk about the dream, Kim, or should I go into?
Well, but why don't you go? I had a dream with Paul was in recently. Paul appeared in a dream recently. It was a very simple dream. And I took my in the dream, I took my parents out to have a beer and listen to music, and Paul was the music. And in a sense, it wasn't profound, but in a sense, it was wonderful. I almost never dream of my parents. And we were together and having a really nice time. And the music was lovely. And it was that kind of comforting thing, which is another aspect of who Paul was, as we've heard from everybody else, his generosity and gentleness. Your dream was different.
Yeah, my dream. So we sort of gave a title, at least a part of our remarks, called Dreams of Paul. But maybe I would just set the stage a little to preface my dream with, set the stage in a very theatrical sense. To start my remarks, let's call this production Cornish in Crisis, season 15 for me, episodes are numberless. And the plot rarely changes. Some characters come and go, right? But it was my good fortune in those years when I started at Cornish. I joined the CFT right away, and Paul became a close friend and colleague. And I know he was a member, dues-paying member of the CFT, though the CFT represents all faculty, whether paying dues or not. He was a member from the beginning, which was 1979. And it's the only private college represented by American Federation of Teachers in the state of Washington, Little Cornish Federation of Teachers. So, fiercely won union in a time, I wonder if it could be possible for Cornish to be unionized now. But Paul was a fierce defender of faculty, constant defender of faculty in the years that we worked together there, and the complex relationship, as Kim has referred to, of the union to an employer. I learned that we shared a lifelong commitment to the values of the union, progressive politics, and in my experience, it was the most supportive community among faculty at Cornish, outside of departments and more than departments, a system of mutual aid in an institution that rarely felt secure or interdisciplinary, really. The union created that opportunity. So for me as president of CFT after Paul retired in 2018 and as his vice president for 8 years, and I think I was Kim's vice president too. Always the bridegroom, never the bride, or whatever it is. His support, patience, and advice in many fraught circumstances was invaluable. The shock of his death, the loss for so many of us and on many levels, created a time of deep reflection. And I have been looking for signs to help me understand and accept the painful realization about all that cannot happen now in our friendship. Jim and I talked to Paul about this, trekking with Paul and Susan in some far away place. We really wanted to do that with them. Delicious meals and wine, a taste that Paul and I shared. Social justice, political action, humor and culture, and the difference between old and new classical music. I still don't understand that. Was always hoping to learn more. His genius for keeping a life in balance and productive with demands of the Cornish syndrome. 2 weeks after his death and during the traumatic series of negotiations going on at the college without Paul as my advisor, I had a dream. I was at a union meeting and Paul arrived carrying a mysterious manuscript, a page like a musical score, I thought, an abstract language I couldn't really read, but the sheet was a tapestry, a colorful page divided into squares, each like an illuminated initial in a medieval manuscript, compartmentalized with individual symbols like runes, an ancient script, astrological, Aramaic, I was trying to figure it out, but it was the guide to the resolution needed in our meeting. There was a great sense of relief among us in the dream that Paul was with us again. As an art historian, it is my job to decipher and interpret symbols, visual signs, and iconography, and how to make sense. How could I make sense? What was Paul wanting us to know? And in my interpretation, to find the key to his message, and then I had an aha moment, of course. Paul would really want me to find the right key, right, as a musician. And like the history of the Book of Secrets of the Artist's Workshop, which is an area I study, the secret secretorium, he would be able to transfer his knowledge to us like Hermes Trismegistus, who was the author of the legendary primary alchemical text called the Emerald Tablet, on which stages of the preparation of the Philosopher's Stone are engraved. Practical aspects of astrology, sympathetic magic, talismans like the Kabbalah, and yet a key into the secret life or immortality, question mark. But that key, I discovered, was not the goal for me, but having, at least now, but having access to the deeper knowledge of the person Paul was, the person he was for me, his profound commitment to his music, his generosity and support of other artists, his ironic, realistic, yet optimistic personality, even in a serious health condition. So I would say in my role as the last person of senior faculty currently of CFT, because now it is passed on to a new generation who has never negotiated a contract really. And as former president of CFT, I rescued the CFT archive of the emails of the whole body of CFT that are in Gmail. And of course, there are many things, perhaps in paper copy, I don't have those. Over 6,000 emails are now in my inbox. And they are another Emerald Tablet to be deciphered and used and utilized. And Paul is in most of them. And probably Kim too.
One of the things I was thinking about that you and I talked about in the last few days was how after he retired and you were in the midst of another episode in the Cornish saga, that he didn't disappear, that those commitments and that contact was something that he continued. You want to say something about that?
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Kim, because you are like that too. And many's the time I've called Kim in Sweden and Nancy Kennedy, who is also our AFT representative. But Paul, I could call him every day. And sometimes I had to in the newness of the experiences I was having. And Paul was there for me and for the faculty, particularly in the last year and a half with the reduction in force of senior music faculty, which was incredibly traumatic and painful. There were so many areas that Paul did not go away with retirement, and that was also a subject of kind of amusement too. He might have wanted to, and sometimes he would just say, I have to hang up now, Elizabeth.
I'm retired.
I have to go practice. So I miss him.
I think that's one of the things that was most striking for me is that Paul never abandoned his convictions. He never set them aside. He never, I mean, you mentioned his ironic ability to have that kind of ironic take on what was going on, but it was always serious and always hopeful. And he was always willing and able to work with those convictions to reach agreement with those who didn't share them. He didn't always reach those agreements, but he always worked towards them. It's hard work, and Paul did it with grace and compassion, helping others like me see that compromise is not necessarily acquiescence.
No, and Kim and I
ahead.
have agreed that we're kind of both hotheads in similar ways, and Paul talked us off the ledge in our separate times.
More than once.
Yes, more than once. And And I would say he wasn't cynical. I mean, I don't know if I can say that, but he can be ironic, but not cynical, because he was still a romantic, right?
Yeah.
I think,
Yeah.
so.
I think of his work in the Union and the way he was in other parts of his life that people have talked about already. His music and community and friendship in this way too. Well, he was a sublime solo player. He reached out to others and played along in the best sense, standing out, but also stepping aside, blending in, breathing with his co-conspirators. That was something I was going to say earlier. We were talking about community and the connection between people. And I think of us as co-conspirators in the sense that conspiracy, the root of conspiracy is breathing together, which I think is appropriate for Paul's flute playing and also appropriate for the way that he works blended with his co-conspirators, making it possible for all of us to live more fully together.
Yes, I think you've said it there. And yeah.
So Susan, thank you for staying on us, both of us, to participate today, and thank everybody for being here, and thanks Paul for being.
Yeah, for breathing.
Yeah.
Still breathing.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for both of your sets of remarks. It was actually really, really nice to have you join us with this. So, all right.
Thank you.
So this is Beth Traxler again, and I am going to now bring up the second video piece that's provided by Lori DeLuca and her klezmer compatriots. And then immediately after this piece, we will pivot to remarks from a couple of other people near and dear to Paul, including Lori, to make some remarks before we come back to a couple remarks more from direct family members. And so, first the musical piece, which is Nifty's Freyak, and I'm sorry, Lori, if I butchered the name of it. And then immediately after this, I will spotlight Lori, and she will join us for a few minutes with her remarks. So let me just share my screen and bring up the next musical piece. And then you'll get Lori very immediately afterwards.
I'm just going to send a message to Elizabeth.
One of the most popular
You message her.
Yeah.
It's just a chat.
century
Yeah.
fun. He was just a fantastic improviser and spearheaded a lot of wonderful pieces. And he wrote this one. It's called Nifty's Freyak.
Hello. I'm Lori DeLuca, and I'm a clarinetist, friend of Paul's for 34 years. It's been my privilege, my honor to know such a wonderful human being, especially to have been able to see a great part of the arc of his life. And just today, I'm learning a whole lot more about him as a young man, as a young person, and the influences that helped launch him. But I see where that started and then the fruition of that through my relationship, the longevity of my relationship with him. So I met Paul in 1987. I had just moved to Seattle a year earlier for joining the Seattle Symphony. And soon after that, as Roger Nelson had mentioned, I joined the new performance group in which Paul and Roger were members. And that introduced me to Paul's life at Cornish College and many of the faculty and exciting things that were happening, especially in the contemporary music world in Seattle, meaning connections with John Cage, Merce Cunningham, Feldman, and then of course composers at Cornish such as Janis Gatek, Jared Powell, Tom Baker, and the fun performances that Roger and his wife Tommy Eckert participated in back then. But as all of you know, whether it's a professional relationship or a family relationship, you become his friend. It's not just business. It's a holistic kind of relationship that forms because Paul is interested in so many things. He's able to discuss topics about wine, about tomatoes, about mushroom hunting, as Roger had mentioned, politics, all kinds of music, travel, I mean, everything. So he loved engaging with people on many, many different levels. And early on, we developed a friendship that included going out hiking and skiing. And one of our favorite things was to meet at the farmer's market in the U District on Saturday mornings. And it was a way to just hook up and have a cup of coffee and catch up on life. So in the early days, in addition to all of those things I just mentioned, he actually accompanied me to look at this house that was for sale. That I was looking for a house, looking 15 houses, and then this one came up out of the blue. I said, Paul, would you come with me and look at this house? And he was the first person other than myself that saw this house, which I'm still living in. And that was 32 years ago. So it was really sweet for that to happen. One thing that he also did early on is in the Goodwill Games, which Roger mentioned, he went to Tashkent and the country of Georgia and did an exchange. And I still remember the enthusiasm that he came home with. I mean, this just felt like it was a life-changing experience. And not only, it opened my eyes to the fact that, wow, a musician could have these exchanges across the world and connect with people and play music from that area and bring it back home. And there can be this exchange. Well, that was sort of the precursor to what developed and blossomed later with our involvement with the Seattle Chamber Players, which was a chamber music group that we just casually got together as friends beginning in 1989, just reading chamber music, mostly classical and romantic music, some members of the symphony and Paul. And then it started to kind of coalesce. We had a series at a church and maybe did 3 concerts a season. But over about the 10 years, we all realized that we all love contemporary music. And this is then what became our focus. And through Paul's incredible organizational skills, as we've heard early on, you know, developing the things at Bucks Rock and being the organizer, Paul and I shared organizing the administrative work for Seattle Chamber Players, but Paul did all the grant writing, and his percentage for successful grants was, I mean, the batting average was incredibly high, probably one of the best in the city for sure. His meticulous way of making sure all the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted, and just his ability to write and communicate ideas, be very clear and thorough about all of that was, you know, it was top notch. It's what was needed. And that helped us to continue performing and commission many, many, many works. I mean, we commissioned at least 100 pieces. And a lot of those were to his credit. And also later on, we enlisted the help of Elena Dubinets, a fantastic music scholar from Russia, who actually, Paul is the one who made the initial phone call when we found out that she lived in Bellevue, and she was just newly arrived. And we read that she had put on this huge festival of Russian music at the University of Iowa, of all places. And she lived in Bellevue, Washington, because her husband worked for Microsoft. So Paul called her out of the blue one day, and within 2 weeks of talking to her, she had planned our first Icebreaker Festival with the Seattle Chamber Players. And for the next 15 years, we put on many, many more Icebreaker Festivals, which were basically choosing a geographic location in the world and focusing on music from that area, commissioning composers from the area, as well as scholars, bringing them to Seattle, having a weekend festival, and then eventually, like what Paul did as far as the exchange of the Goodwill Games, we would be invited to go to their country. So that means that Paul and I, we work together in this way, along with David Saby, cellist, Misha Schmidt, our violinist, and Elena Dubinets, our music advisor. We worked together for 25 years, putting on a series of concerts in Seattle. We traveled to Russia, Poland, parts of Europe. We've gone to Costa Rica and China. over that period of time. Paul was a fantastic travel companion, very easygoing, very curious. I remember him with his guidebook and us navigating the subway in Moscow. And he was really set on trying to read the signs of the subway in Cyrillic and then cross-referencing them in his book, and realized that the fonts were different in the book as opposed to what was up on the subway sign. So it was a little confusing, but we found our way. So Paul was responsible both through the Seattle Chamber Players and all of his work with the National Flute Society and the local chapter of the Seattle Flute Society. He was the president of that organization. He served on many, many boards. He served on granting panels in Seattle. He was involved in Chamber Music America. But I just wanted to highlight 2 commissions that he did. One for sure was with the National Flute Association, commissioning a piece by Gia Concelli, who is a composer in the country of Georgia. It's an amazing piece. It's a huge project that he helped spearhead, help raise the money and do all the communication. And Paul actually did the premiere performance and recorded the piece. And it is, you know, it stands out in the 21st century repertoire as a very important new piece of music. So I you know, all of his work as an organizer, as a mentor to young composers, young flute students, students at Cornish, I just, you know, the long list of things is just incredible. And as a friend, Paul was always remembering my birthday. And this is a hat he gave me on my 50th. And I love this hat. I just wore it for a performance that actually was in a film. It was cabaret music. So I also remember a couple of years ago, he took me out to a really fancy Japanese restaurant. We had a great meal. And these were the little things that he did, but they all added up. He was always a really, really sincere, good friend, somebody who cared about me. He cared about people. As was mentioned, it was never about him. It was always about you. How are you? What are you up to? How are your family? How are your folks? This is something that I think is rare. With all of the accomplishments, he was not a boastful person. He's very humble and appreciative. And I just love the fact that he made time to travel with Susan every year, take a huge trip. He made time for swimming and bike riding and growing all kinds of vegetables and tomatoes and garlic. We all know about all those things, but they just all added up to Paul, you know, and his own sweet way of living his life and enjoying the simple things in life, a good glass of wine, a nice espresso, taking time out to acknowledge that, yes, there's work to be done, and he was a worker bee, and then there was time to relax. So I really miss Paul. I can't even really believe he's not here, but he is here. He's in my heart. He's in all of our hearts. So I am I could keep going, but I'm going to stop now. But thank you all for being here and adding all the things that you have said this morning or this afternoon, and all the reasons why you love Paul as well.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Leonard Garrison. And it's so wonderful to hear all of these different perspectives on Paul's life. And I'm a flutist, and I teach at the University of Idaho here in Moscow, Idaho. And Paul has been my best friend for the past 20 years. So I vividly remember when Paul and I first met at a flute convention in the early 2000s. A mutual acquaintance had introduced us, and it was a friendship at first sight. I had read his articles on flute music behind the Iron Curtain and said, "Oh, you're Paul Taub. I've always wanted to meet you." And he said, "And I've always wanted to meet you." A couple of years later, Paul served on the board of the National Flute Association while I was president. I admired his thoughtful contributions to meetings as a result of his long experience in serving various organizations. He was first an advocate for new music, but was able to see all sides of an issue. He was a truly creative thinker, a problem solver, and he knew how to talk to people. Paul and I started hanging out together at flute conventions and eventually became annual roommates. We had identical interests and tastes: food, wine, travel, new flute music, baseball, progressive politics, France, the outdoors. In Las Vegas, we found a Thai restaurant well away from the strip in a rundown strip mall. We were in such ecstasy over the food that we had to go back the next night. He preferred cutting-edge music, but was open to all works in all styles, if they were well-written and interesting. If he didn't like something, he didn't disparage it. And I never heard him say anything negative about another person. We collaborated on many projects and formed the Iwo Quartet, I for Idaho, W for Washington, and O for Oregon, with our friends and fantastic flutists Sydney Carlson and Jennifer Rhine. Paul was game for anything, the most fiendishly difficult music, and was a wonderful colleague, diplomatic in rehearsals. I was a guest many times in his home, and he in mine. We chatted on FaceTime every couple of weeks. I've always thought Paul and Susan led a charmed life. Their bountiful garden was designed so you didn't even have to bend down to pick things. Their comfy home is minutes from everything you could want in life, from year-round farmers markets to the symphony. Paul would go with the flow. Anything I proposed, he would say, "Sure." He liked to talk baseball, but was of course not the single-minded Chicago Cubs fan that I am. He visited me once in October 2016 when the Cubs were struggling through the playoffs towards their only World Series win in a century. As we don't have a TV, we went to a scuzzy sports bar, and Paul shared my joy at the Cubs' triumph that night. Paul was a planner. He liked to organize, and wherever he went, he first researched the best restaurants, farmers markets, and public transportation, which he absolutely loved. Whenever I visited him, he would expend much mental energy choosing Seattle's most interesting restaurants. I can't overstate his influence in the flute world, even the music world. In his many roles as a flute soloist, as chair of the National Flute Association's New Music Advisory Committee, as a founding member of the Seattle Chamber Players, and as twice president of the Seattle Flute Society, he is probably responsible for more commissions than any other flutist of our time. When I had the honor of playing at his retirement recital at Cornish, I realized he was a local hero, as the capacity crowd applauded wildly after each work. He was, of course, the go-to flutist for new music in Seattle. Although he leaves a great legacy as a musician, I remember Paul best for his personal magnetism and warmth, the pleasure he took in life. Thank you so much.
Hi again, I'm back. Simply to introduce the transition now to remarks from close family, additional close family. Paul had a very close and wonderful relationship with his niece Dana, and she's going to speak next.
Hi, my name is Dana. I'm Paul's niece. I don't know if Paul knew this, and I wish I'd told him more, but he and Susan have always been my favorite people to brag about knowing. Paul is the sweetest, most wonderful man you could imagine, I would tell people, and Susan is incredibly kind and patient. They're perfect for each other. Paul and Susan have been two of the most important people in my life, endlessly supportive, always present, and unwavering in their belief in me. Throughout my years, Paul and Susan provided me a physical and emotional place to go to and feel cared for. I wrote about their home in a journal entry titled, "A House Down the Road to Feel Safe In." One of my favorite things about Paul was his passion, particularly his unapologetic pursuit of the things that he cared about. As you all know, he loved music. He also loved gardening, going to farmers markets, cooking, and traveling. He was deeply devoted to helping people in a worldly context, as well as to the happiness and well-being of himself and the people closest to him. Paul inspired me to commit myself to the things I loved and leave behind what I didn't. He was excited when I announced in 4th grade that I was going to start playing the flute and kindly gave me lessons for years. Equally important to me was his acceptance when I told him a few years later that I was done with the instrument. "Okay, what's next?" he asked. Much of what I miss about Paul are his quirkier qualities. This past Christmas, I designed a game for our families to play during our holiday dinner Zoom call. I made a bingo board with people's funny tendencies, like telling the same joke twice or referencing a particular TV show. When I was making the game, I told my mom, "It's hard not to make this all about Paul. He's just so easy to make fun of." Sure enough, that evening, Paul talked about his vegetable garden, spelled out big words, and told stories about Buck's Rock. Many times, Paul told me about things he did that I couldn't help but burst out laughing at, like his practice of plucking slugs out of his garden with chopsticks to protect his plants. It's hard for me to believe that Paul's gone. He used to go traveling for weeks or go off to play flute somewhere, and there's still a part of me that thinks he's going to come back. I know that I will continue to miss him every day for the rest of my life, and losing him is one of the hardest things that I've gone through. When I first heard the news that he was gone, I burst out crying. After a while, I looked at my mom and I said, "He had a good life." I don't think that Paul would regret anything that he didn't get to do. He always pursued what he wanted to do, passionately loved who he wanted to love, and took care of himself and the people around him. I feel so lucky that I got to know Paul, and I'll never forget. Thanks.
Hi, Susan, Paul's wife, Susan, has asked me to read her comments. So I will. This is from Susan. Paul and I had a sweet, close, calm relationship. I remember the first time I got angry with him about something he did, or maybe it was something he didn't do. I've forgotten the incident. I was upset and blasted him verbally and then steeled myself to be blasted right back. But instead, Paul sat for a minute thinking and then replied, "Okay, you're unhappy about this. Let's see what we can do to fix it." And that calm, reasonable approach of his became the template for working out challenges and issues and making decisions throughout our time together. Our relationship was mutually supportive. I was supportive of his music and teaching career and all his various other interests, and he was supportive of me and my work as a social worker and therapist for abused children, and also for my activities as an amateur musician. I attended his concerts, and he rubbed my neck after stressful days at my job. We shared a lot of activities, such as gardening, hiking, and traveling, but also gave each other the space to pursue independent activities. Together, we were involved with Get Out the Vote efforts, especially since 2016, and volunteered with a progressive Seattle organization, Common Power. In his last year, Paul, in his typical way, became highly active with this group. Paul and I met in 1991 on a summer solstice. There's a story from that time that I like to remember. I was drawn to Paul immediately and felt very comfortable with him and knew I wanted him in my life in some capacity, but I wasn't sure if I wanted him to be more than a friend. It became apparent after a while that his intentions were more romantic. That summer, he was gone for several weeks teaching at a music camp in France. One night during that time, while I was working as an emergency room social worker, there was a terrible tragedy involving a child. Everyone working in the ER was deeply affected, and when I went home that night, I just wanted to talk to Paul. But there was no way to reach him, as there was no phone at the camp, and this was in pre-cell phone days. So I called his home answering machine, just to listen to his voice. And then I called it again, and again, and again. And it dawned on me that I was pretty sure I wanted him to be more than a friend. And so he was for nearly 30 years. Paul died of a rare, aggressive heart disease called cardiac amyloidosis, informally referred to as stiff heart disease. There is no cure for this, although a form of chemotherapy can sometimes stop the progression of symptoms. He had been having concerning symptoms for at least several months prior to his death, which increased in severity the last 6 weeks of his life. His condition was finally diagnosed only a few days before he died, but Paul, ever the optimist, remained upbeat and hopeful that chemotherapy would help him. His heart stopped working 2 days before chemo was scheduled to begin. In his last days, he was still able to play his beloved flute for short periods, and he was full of plans and ideas for future projects. We spent the evening that turned out to be his last, holding hands, watching TV as the Mark Morris dance group danced to the music of Mozart. And I will add from my own perspective that it was a great good fortune for Paul in his life to have shared those 30 years with Susan, whom we all love in this family. So we're going to have another musical interlude now, and if you're following along in your program, you'll know that that will be followed by a few additional remarks from guests who have asked to make comments as well. So I'll turn it back to Beth to introduce the next musical piece.
So the next musical piece is Tanz, Tanz, Tanz.
Our next selection will be Tanz, 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 typical, another fun dance, starts very slow and builds until all hell breaks loose.
Hello, everybody. I'm Robert Dick, and I'm a musician friend of Paul's. We met. Well, I'm not sure when we met. It's like we seem to always know each other. Possibly late 70s, early 80s. Anyway, one of my earlier memories of Paul was how excited he was that he had met this woman named Susan, and he was very, very hopeful, and it really did work out. I'd like to offer a kind of different perspective, one based on the experience of performing music with Paul, which I did quite a few times. It was music I wrote too, and performing music can be described as hearing it so well that other people can hear it too. And Paul played so well because he heard so well, because he really, really listened. And I think that's a characteristic many people have underlined in thinking about Paul, but it was so palpable and visceral and feelable when you actually made music with him. And at the master classes I give, I often make this comment that one's tone is living information. Inside the sound, you can hear so much, so many things, in particular, all about the person who's making the tone. And listening to Paul play the flute, one experienced this absolute radiance. It wasn't simplistic. It was a deep, complex, multi-dimensional, I don't have the vocabulary for it, radiance. And that radiance was the vehicle through which the tremendous emotional message of his playing was communicated. Paul was not someone, to go for stage histrionics. His manner was very, straightforward and modest and completely about the music. And yet the message itself was very powerful. And that came through his radiance. And I'd like to end with just another comment on which is that there are two kinds of reverberation. There's the physical reverberation that takes place in any space, and it comes to an end. There's emotional reverberation, and Paul's emotional reverberation is going to stay in the world for as long as everyone he touched will be in the world too. So thank you so much.
There you are.
Oh, they unmuted me. All right. An honor to have a chance to say a few words about dear Paul. Paul Taub was very excited to have me involved with various projects, and I am forever grateful. It began innocently enough when he and other members asked me to be guest with the new performance group in residence at Cornish College of the Arts. This happened at various times during his early years at Cornish, and enjoyed being with that very special group. The most prominent was during the 1993-94 season when the new performance group was invited to be part of Music in Motion, a national project led by Joseph Franklin. In this case, I was one of the guest composers, and we all met on 3 separate one-week occasions in Minneapolis. The result was a collaborative group effort entitled Melanda Embracing, and I was amazed and pleased with what the new performance group musicians had to offer. For Paul's Ooh-Ee CD, he commissioned several composers, of which I was one. Alternate Realities, 1988-99, was my contribution, and he took on that challenge with a commitment, courage, and gusto. I was impressed by his determination and ultimate mastery of the 3 movements he chose to play. We had quite a time when he organized a Henry Brant residency during 1995 that involved Cornish, the University of Washington, and Town Hall, Seattle, with great fun and wonderful music. Later, with the Seattle Chamber Players, various Brant pieces were recorded, including his Headhunt, the solo trombone with chamber music, in the magical Bastyr University Chapel. I continue to enjoy remembering these and other collaborations with Paul and his musical colleagues, and I treasure his bubbly and infectious enthusiasm. He brought a lovely sense of occasion to any project he took on, and I feel especially blessed and fortunate to have known and worked with him. Of course, I can assume that Paul made a lot of people feel that way. He was that special. Thank you very much.
Hello, hello. Hi, everybody. I'm Jovino Santos Neto. I'm very touched to be part of this celebration. Hope you can hear me okay there. Okay, good sound. And it's hard to say a few words about Paul because that's literally impossible because you always want to say so much. But for the sake of the time of everyone who's here, I want to say that I came from Brazil to Seattle in 1993 as a student at Cornish College of the Arts. So I arrived in the very early September, 28 years ago with my family. And the degree to which Paul Taub has welcomed me, and I believe from the testimonies that I've heard so many other people, was incredible because I have a cassette tape right behind me here from December of that same year in which I'm already playing a flute quartet with Paul, music written by my musical mentor, Hermeto Pascoal, that very few people have never heard about, including probably so many of you in the music business that don't know Hermeto. But Paul immediately not only embraced Hermeto's music, because Hermeto is an amazing flutist, one of the greatest in the world alive today. He could write for the flute so well, and I'm just a kind of like a dilettante at the flute, but Paul could play those things that Hermeto wrote so brilliantly, including a piece for 10 flutes that we performed at Cornish, several quartets, and some duos of Paul and myself. He actually took me as a kind of like a funny flute player to the National Flute Convention, where we presented several pieces by Hermeto and several other Brazilian pieces together. So we had a repertoire as a duo, and I'm so happy to know that we actually recorded some music together that has never been released. So I think this would be a great time to let the world hear some of the work we've done over the years, recordings that go back 20 years ago, something like this, as well as some more contemporary things. Paul has always been extremely welcoming, embracing, not only...
Hey, Jovino, could you turn your sound up? You're a little low.
Okay, I can certainly turn my sound up. Hang on, let me just make sure. Can you hear me better now?
Much better.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. Thank you, Karen. Anyway, what I was saying is that Paul's attitude of embracing and making things work, his organizational skills have always impressed me, and I was so happy within 6 months of arriving in Seattle, become his colleague at Cornish College of the Arts until now, forever, because we're, with so many people from the Cornish community speaking here, I feel so happy to have been one of the branches of that nice tree, which Cornish is, and so many of us here share those roots. But the sense that Paul was open to the things from the outside, and we could always bring new things. Several times I composed pieces from my jazz ensemble, and Paul was a guest. We always played with us without any problem. So that helped in the sense of making a connection to the Seattle music community, which I embrace to this day. I've always enjoyed living in Seattle, and Paul was a big reason for that. Of course, his vegetables in the summer were always a joy to go and to pick together. We shared bike rides together and hike recommendations. Him and Susan, me and my wife, are always in touch about the latest farmers market. So it is, as Robert Dick has said so well, the reverberations continue in a spiritual, emotional, and a physical way too. We just don't have any instruments to measure them yet. Maybe we never will. But those reverberations, they will continue because once that is sent out in the universe, and nothing closer to the breath and to the heart than the flute. So I think that Paul, through his flute work, he was just as active in his labor organizing, in his community work, in his working for justice, for the right thing to be done. And in that sense, I've been the recipient of his benefaction so many times that I stopped counting. I can just say that I'm very grateful for having met Paul and to have the brilliant musical relationship with him and a friendship too, as I believe many of you here in this meeting today. So thank you so much for listening to me.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? I assume someone will let me know if you cannot. So I'm Bella Mae Palethorpe. I'm a public radio reporter here in Seattle, and I work at a station that's an NPR affiliate. I'm on the news side, but it is very much about music. It's dual format, music and news. So Paul was one of my first and most important music teachers. I was a student of his. I took private lessons from him when I was in high school. I think I was 13 or maybe 14 when we met. That was 40 years ago. And I didn't become a flutist, obviously. I only played seriously till college, but the lessons that Paul taught me have stuck with me through the years. He really opened my young brain to understanding what music can be. So of course, you know, we worked on the traditional classical repertoire. Telemann's Suite in A minor was a favorite of mine, and we worked hard on that for auditions and all kinds of things. But I will never forget the time when he presented a piece for us to play together during our lesson. And this was a trio for two flutes. So the overtones of two dissonant notes played together created the third voice. And this just blew my mind. So life went on. I went off to do other things. And later I came back to Seattle and wound up joining the board of the Seattle Chamber Players that Lori and others spoke about. You know, and this group not only presented, but also commissioned so much new music that was presented, you know, to audiences here and around the world. And that was a huge contribution that was due in no small part to Paul's organizing and his work and his love of music and his openness and his kind heart. His ability to connect with people and motivate them and organize them to do things. I didn't serve on the board in recent years, but at the beginning of the pandemic, I saw a note on Paul's Facebook page writing about his experience being one of the very first patients to survive the coronavirus. And so I called him up and we talked about it, and a colleague got in touch and we put a piece on the air that I think was a really good and important one. And I loved how Paul spoke very eloquently about, you know, the struggle to get through this intense illness and to regain his ability to breathe and to play, but also was very clear in making the point that he had way more tools to get through that than many other people did. And he was just so conscious of talking about equity and making sure that those points were made. And he also, you know, I asked him, well, so are you going to give blood? Are you going to become a studied for science? And he said he would give his blood if the doctors seemed kind of, scientists seemed pretty interested in it. And he would like to do that, to contribute to science in that way, to have his antibodies somehow help others. So, you know, I just, it is so shocking that he's gone, and I miss him, and I will carry his lessons with me. And I just only wish that I'd had more opportunities for more conversations.
Thank you so much. David, can you?
Yes. Well, we're nearing the conclusion of the program, but I feel, having heard everybody speak, that Paul would be unhappy with me if I didn't take the moment to thank every one of you who's on this Zoom for enriching his life. You know, we've talked a lot about how he has enriched the lives of others, but Paul isn't here to speak for himself. But I know from listening to you and also from talking to Paul over the years that the warmth and love and enjoyment that each of you has brought into his life helped to make it a truly wonderful life, shorter than we would have liked, but high quality in every way. And I know it was a happy life for Paul. So from him, a sincere thank you. We're going to have one more musical interlude. It's called Miserlou. And then I think Fred will resume the slideshow that was shown as we were assembling. Those of you who are interested in seeing more of the pictures can stay on as long as you would like and see the slideshow. Will probably be kept up for 10 or 15 minutes is my guess. But when you feel ready, you can drop off the call. So Beth, I send it back to you to attach us to the last musical interlude.
Thank you so much. So the last musical piece, and many thanks to Lori and her klezmer friends for all these fantastic pieces. And here we go.
Oh, we love you. And we really miss you.